Today on the show, should social media companies be responsible for minimizing the harms of political polarization? Then, how do you stay friends with your co founders? And finally, how do you attract a founding team as a cooperative business? Henry, are we responsible for the unintended harm done by our products as entrepreneurs?
As a simple answer, yes, absolutely. I think when it comes to that responsibility, of course, there's tons of laws and regulations that protect consumers by any harm that a company may intend or not intend to cause. This can take the form of class action lawsuits or the government suing the company directly for harm done to the public. However, the topic today is less so about the legal framework and more about ethics and how do we want our customers to feel or think. This gets a lot more into a gray area where the current laws don't really help guide businesses. I think you and I are both discussing this today because in the US, we're in an election year. Things are getting heated up on the political discourse, and media companies play a major role in that. It's pretty topical.
Yeah, talking about social media companies, right? Back in the day, in the days of Walter Cronkite and the nightly news, right? There are 5 channels. Everyone is reporting on the same topics. Everyone is tuning in at roughly the same time. There's a common language, system, and habit of how we consume media. And now, in a much more fractured media landscape where there's thousands of publications and an entire new economic media structure that prioritizes more sensational or polarizing content, it's hard as an electorate to not become, polarized at either end, to even in some cases be convinced in some sense of conspiracy theories and very negative beliefs and views that are like factually untrue, and then incite action that might be harmful to themselves or others for those beliefs. And I think we both agree that the algorithmically generated feed is a culprit technology in terms of what has created this type of media environment with social media. But Henry, the question I have for you, is it the responsibility of the developers of this technology, algorithmically generated feeds, to own that outcome of polarization? Or is it completely up to the use of these feeds by the public? Who's responsible for this outcome? And how do we reason about a technology that has harms that no one intended but are so vast, in some ways we don't even really understand them fully? How do we think about that as entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think when you exist in a democratic system, individual responsibility is important, right? Going into my personal opinions or ethics, if we look at a separate issue like climate change, I am less of a proponent of forcing individuals to make sure you recycle because that's
Mm-hmm.
going to save the planet. I would rather put our efforts into regulating businesses that have a much larger impact rather than spending a bunch of resources chasing down individuals to make better decisions. I think create a system so that those individuals almost have to make a better decision. Plastic straws, you can't buy them because companies aren't allowed to sell them. That's how I approach things. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up that point. There's this relationship between what businesses are allowed to do and what's allowed by the systemic agreed upon rules, either in terms of consumer protection laws or general regulation. Does that absolve a company of responsibility in terms of making these? Yeah, if you take climate change as an example, steps towards becoming either carbon neutral, reducing their carbon footprint, or do you just have to wait until the government regulates in order to change?
I think the government has to do some regulation
I
just
agree, yeah.
because in the competitive space, you want it to be fair, right? If you want
Right?
market factors to serve customers in a way that they're willing to pay for it, I think in terms of sustainability, decreasing negative outcomes, negative externalities are not taken into account when we think about supply and demand. So that's where you need a regulatory body to step in. I wanted to set the table with that idea of climate change, but Don't get me wrong, this is so different than that because if we're talking about social media platforms and media platforms in general, we're not talking about having a carbon tax or, you know,
Mhm.
cleaning up a supply chain for the environment. We're talking about the transmission of ideas and how that can impact or polarize a political election. I think this boils down to not necessarily algorithms putting people in different camps where they're isolated. Think that's okay generally. Like, I don't want to force people into debate. Wrestling with ideas together, debating ideas, super important, but I'm not necessarily suggesting that social media companies should give you both sides to every topic and issue. But where I do think the issue is when lies are being amplified by social media companies. And I don't know how you solve that. Do you have any ideas or do you think that's a good crux to the issue?
I think that's exactly the crux of the issue. If we think about how a lot of these social media platforms feel the pressure from lawmakers, this is directly affecting the way that they achieve power. They are trying to play this both sides game. Specifically, a lot of the changes to showing a Wikipedia banner if they detect a certain topic or whatever as a way of saying, oh, we're going to try to be a neutral editorial place, right? We're going to try to make sure that people, if we detect maybe that they are in a topic that's political, which I'd be hard pressed to find any topic that's not political, uh, that's their way of trying to fix it and making the lawmakers happy so that they don't experience any sort of regulation. That way, what it's proven that these companies are, by nature of the algorithmically generated feed, providing editorial about what people see. If we look back at the thing that allows them to do that without any sort of repercussions or responsibility, that's like Section 230, which, if people don't know, is a section of a law passed in 1996 called the Decency Act. And it was to prevent social media companies and generally internet companies as a whole from having mostly pornographic content on their websites. And the law basically says that none of these companies are liable for the things that their users decide to put on their platforms, which has been used by these companies now for decades to absolve them of any responsibility of editorial, even though they are, as we can obviously see, deciding what is seen and not seen, which is a type of editorial. And so there's been a
That's a great
ton.
point. That's a
Yeah,
great point,
yeah,
right?
exactly. And so there's been a ton of, should we get rid of Section 230? Should we not? Have you heard a lot about this argument? And what's your current stance or thoughts on that?
I think the idea of Section 230 and not placing the responsibility on these huge platforms makes sense from the perspective of we now have a media landscape which promotes diversity of thought, right? We have thousands, if not millions, of individual contributors or independent or
Right.
alternative media sources. The idea that one platform would be able to moderate that much content, I think when Section 230 was passed, that was a major driver of the
Totally.
resources required to do that are not possible. We
And
will,
especially
as
not
a
possible for
government,
companies.
up and coming
Mhm.
startups. How could you incur that cost upon them when we're trying to build this thing of the internet and allow everybody to communicate freely and openly? So
Right.
I think positive intentions were definitely around, but I think today, especially when you think about polarization and extreme views, it goes down on social media.
Yeah.
That's where these algorithms promote these types of ideas. People are almost isolated in their bubbles to only be further radicalized or just lied to. I feel like a
Yeah.
lot of times I might see political content where they are just not representing the facts of the issue.
Right.
That's a huge problem when we're in a democracy and we need the electorate to be informed.
Mhm.
It's really tough when someone can lie in order to misrepresent a political opponent or misrepresent an issue in order to drive fear to then drive support to themselves. I think that's the real danger. Do you think Section 230 can solve this by repealing, improving upon that legislation?
Well, I think you just said, and a lot of it is the sentiment supporters for keeping Section 230 is we want to encourage the free and open internet, right? We want to allow upstarts and new companies to enter these markets without having to compete with requiring large scale algorithmic moderation. That is part of what the law does really well to keep competition in the market. The thing it was not designed for is a world where companies not only host content from users, but curate that content, which is a kind of editorial. I'm hammering that home. In a world where that is a kind of editorial, I think that Section 230 absolves too much responsibility. If we were to revise the law, if I had a magic wand, and this is not me just coming up with thoughts from my own brain, this is a lot me parroting the work of people like Cory Doctorow, who have delved so deep into this issue. But if we were to say to these companies and pass new legislation that says Section 230 is still free and fine, but we now decide that algorithmically generated feeds are a kind of editorial, and companies are responsible for the content that they recommend on those feeds, either recommend, autoplay, whatever. And I think what that would is very quickly dismantle the idea of things like the YouTube homepage or autoplay recommendations or all these things that take people down these rabbit holes and incentivize content who want to feed and stoke fear, right? That's the tough thing about a lot of these feeds. They don't take into account the emotions of the people that are watching the content or creating the content, and whether those emotional states are positive, negative, high energy, low energy. The people that get promoted and encouraged both financially and with views are people that can game that system. But if we were to say, okay, YouTube, for example, now the things that you recommend on the homepage, you are saying a kind endorsement to that content. And that endorsement to the content comes just if you're an editorial publisher of a newspaper with some sense liability and responsibility. So quickly, I think YouTube would remove the idea of the algorithmically generated feed, and we'd see a lot more human to human interaction in terms of discovery and recommendation. But what do you think about this seedling of an idea, Henry?
Yeah, I think it would be a short line of text on the law, but this is a massive change, right?
Totally.
I think you anticipating that a lot of these platforms, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, those home feeds, those algorithms would become non-existent. Another alternative future could be they just become way more regulated. These are very wealthy media companies. Is it reasonable to expect them to hire hundreds of people, thousands of people to moderate these feeds? That is expensive. It is, a limiting factor or a barrier of entry for competition. But could an Instagram do it if this legislation came down? If you're worried about getting your content and your little dopamine when you just start flipping through, I think it's still possible. But if we assume it's gone, no more home feed, your content is curated only by the individuals or accounts that you follow. Subscribers mean something again. Woohoo! YouTube is saved. That subscriber count matters. Here's where I wonder if it doesn't go far enough. If now these platforms are not responsible for the information that they're recommending or curating, you would still be able to view content that is harmful. Maybe not illegal, maybe not inciting
Totally.
violence, but misrepresenting the truth, depicting a political opponent as something that they are not, lying, things like this. On the one hand, freedom of speech, right? You can follow whoever you want, you can consume their content. The responsibility to not break any laws and not copyright infringement or defamation, that is on the individual, no longer on a platform. Never was, but we're setting the record straight.
Yeah.
I'm on board with this, but I think there comes a point where platforms are still providing a platform to individuals that may be misrepresenting the truth,
Right.
swaying the public. So even if we take the algorithm away, do you think that is enough? Or do you think if somebody is lying, should they
Yeah.
be removed? Should you ban people from these social platforms where they don't need any credentials to get on them? It's just a megaphone for whatever you want. What do you think? Is that too extreme?
I think in terms of large scale regulation, that's too hard. That's where you get into it's almost anti competitive to say that the companies have to moderate all the content on the platform. That's just a huge scale, both technical and human problem. The thing that gets to the crux is this tension between a freedom of speech argument and a safety argument. Thankfully, a lot of these larger companies have dedicated trust and safety teams that do have human people that go in and look for this type of content and have long and detailed terms of service and community guidelines policies in order to mitigate the worst of that arena. The reason that I think I'd be less scared of that type of content in a world where it probably could never get on an algorithmically generated feed is because to discover that type of content now requires a human to human interaction. Another creator on the platform you follow and trust, or a friend you trust, has to tell you to watch this video. And in that moment, there's some reciprocity of getting information from a peer or a slight power dynamic, but one that you can actually judge for yourself whether or not this
Yeah.
person seems credible, something you'd be interested in exploring. Whereas right now, because that there's almost an implicit uh, trust in the platform itself that is so large. If it's coming across my feed, I almost implicitly trust it. And there's no reciprocity to understand why this is being recommended to me, who caused this to pop up for me. It makes it harder for people to judge for themselves whether this content aligns with their values. Does that make any sense?
It is a little murky though, because it almost then implies that people don't have a choice what content they consume. That's true, but also not true, right? I go
No, I
onto
totally
social
get it.
media, I swipe through stuff I don't want to see, I tap on videos I do want to see. So I do have a choice, but when you think about algorithms today, that choice has a filter on it, right? And it
Exactly.
could be a very suggestive filter that we don't know about.
Yeah, there's less
Mhm.
time to think and to have that moment of reflection because it just appears and you can click on it instantly. Whereas in this alternate universe where you have actual understanding of why this is being recommended to you and more time in either conversation or recommendation, that this is an actual conversation you're having with another human, which is something we're good at and good at figuring out trust and judgment that way. And we're not technologically dominated. I think that you give people more of a chance to
Yeah.
actually have that sense of reflection, which I'm not saying they don't have currently, just maybe are not given the same resources, like
It
defense mechanisms, as they would in the other.
Yeah, it comes back to this idea of personal responsibility, right? We
Mm-hmm.
want in a democratic system everyone to be
Exactly.
informed and responsible to figure out the truth and define their ideas. Algorithms, social media platforms are really good at spoon feeding content to you. I think why the algorithm is different than that one to one recommendation or following of a person or a platform or a channel is it's going to be more extreme. If you have an algorithm, you might see 10 different channels, but you're going up a ladder of more
Yeah.
extreme. What's going to engage you more? What's going to shock you more? What's going to get you to comment more? That's their motivation. That's what all these platforms want. Media companies, advertising backed, they want more engagement. There's that. Even if a minimum percentage of users that fall into that trap of becoming radicalized politically, That's what the whole system's trying to do with that style of content. I think that it's a good thing to remove that because it does slow things down, like you said. The biggest impact of this, aside from potentially allowing people to form their ideas in a way that is unfiltered, right, through an algorithm,
Hmm.
is wouldn't this destroy the advertising industry? Did we
Oh,
skip on that?
we might have skirted that issue a little. The thing that gives me hope about brands being encouraged by this is that there's so much about brand safety, right? And that's why we're seeing a increase in direct sponsorships with creators where brands feel like they have more direct control like in a traditional media landscape. We're not necessarily seeing a decrease in programmatic advertising spending, but we are seeing a landscape shift in terms of this constant cycle of something bad happens on YouTube and brands leave and all that stuff. I think it would create a lot more stability because YouTube would have to create more different tools for brands to be able to connect with creators are not a giant lottery system. But also, this is essentially how we did the internet for 10 years. YouTube had a homepage that everyone saw, right? They
Mhm.
were the Walter Cronkite of everyone is watching the same thing, right? That's how we have these like amazing kind of like viral moments that all collectively participate in. And so it worked back then. The ad can still be decided on and generated onto the video that people are watching. The question is whether or not people will watch less because of the lack of an algorithmically generated feed, which may be true. But I also think that we're so prone to media consumption right now that we might replace that with new forms of media that we just don't really see right now because the landscape is so dominated by short form vertical snippets of algorithmically generated feeds that we're seeing right now. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that in closing, we believe social media platforms have a responsibility in polarizing the political discourse due to the algorithms. If you
Yeah.
were to regulate that algorithm heavily, privately or publicly, maybe you could solve it, or just by removing it, you could get back to a place where people have choice and there's human connection and less amplification of extreme ideas. Good reform for Section 230.
Yes. And I'd say, as another closing statement, what I think is important for entrepreneurs as you are speaking directly to you, starting a new product, a new business, to think about these external implications of the technology you're building. How can this affect society in a negative way? And how can you minimize that harm from the get go? And also, maybe even advocate for if you're ahead of your time in your field, like people working in AI research, make sure you can explain to lawmakers and what those potential harms are so we can maintain this sense of dynamic competition where everyone's on the same playing field and build societies that maintain our ethical and moral values as we go.
Two very important points. You and I both have founded companies in the past, may identify ourselves as entrepreneurs, at least very interested in the idea. A lot of people get into business with friends and family, and it becomes not fun anymore. Those relationships get a lot of tension under building a new business. Startups are hard, young businesses are hard, even just small businesses can be really difficult. I know that you've recently been thinking a lot about this. Can you tell me, how do you keep your head above water, maintain those relationships over starting a business with somebody?
Fortunately, the reason I was thinking about this is just this week I got back from a 2.5 week long vacation with myself, my wife, my ex co founder, Keith, and his wife, Chelsea, who's also a friend of ours. I was just thinking about how amazing and magical it is that now, almost 2, 3 years out from closing that business after 3.5 years of working on it together, we're still amazing friends. That there's still so much love in this relationship, so much support for each other. Maybe that is not true for everyone, but also wasn't entirely true even in my own entrepreneurial journey. Like I had two, maybe 2.5 co founders before I met Keith. Both of those relationships ended really uh, treacherous, rocky circumstances. Until recently, I had not talked to either of my past co-founders until I started writing this book and venting some of these ideas out. So I've just been thinking a lot about how I would have done those relationships differently in the early part of Lumastic, the company I started, and also thinking about what made it work the third time. The thing that I kind of have been writing about and coming to terms with is that it is a lot about both your relationship with business, relationship personally, your co-founder's personal relationship with the business. And what I mean by that is I had a personal relationship the first about 2 years Mastic where I was myopic, I'd say. Like I was obsessed with this company. It was the thing that I loved most in the world other than Sarah. In so many ways that made me seem really energetic and passionate. It was good for talking with potential investors, like members of boards to get on accelerator programs. It made it nice when I'd go to pitch competitions and people could see the enthusiasm and love I had for both the product, the customers, the market overall. But in so many ways, too, it also made me internally inside of the business really difficult to work with. I was obsessive and like domineering. I was a big micromanager because I felt like no one could love this thing the way that I loved it. That made it very difficult for me to work with probably anyone, but specifically then your friends who also you try to have a personal relationship with. You try to respect their opinions, make sure they feel valued and taken care of, and that can be subservient to the love you have for the business. If the love isn't matched between the business and the other person, you feel a sense of resentment, especially as things get over equity and ownership and influence and control. All these things that coalesced or went differently later after I learned some of these lessons when I met Keith and we started to develop a friendship. About a year in, we said, no matter what happens, we want to stay friends. That was the thing we declared. And truly, from that day on, I think I was easier to work with. I knew that my business can't love me back, but the people I build my business with can. I'm going to prioritize that as a real emotional relationship instead of this fake parasocial relationship I have with my business. Long-winded way of saying, how do you stay friends with your co-founders? You prioritize your friendship over your business, and you actually mean it. And that's a hard thing to do.
Thank you. I think it's really important to get those ideas out there because as a startup culture, we all know it's difficult to build a business, let alone a successful business. It's hard to survive in business for years on end.
Yep.
Our solution is we want grit. We want a driven founder. We want a founding team that will do whatever it takes and move quickly. Speed is your kind of greatest enemy, but almost the greatest ally in starting a new business. And I think that as a guiding star is what fractures those relationships. The idea of saying business is one thing, saving the planet with this amazing startup is one thing, but my relationships are more important. That is going to build better cultures, better products. The downside, though, and maybe you can push back on this, I think it slows things down, right? If we don't have Drew, the domineering founder, saying, we need to get this done now, we're probably going to slow down. We're going to treat people better. We're going to maybe think through things more, but it's definitely going to slow things down. And I think that really is what goes in the face of current startup culture and what investors and shareholders, not just prioritizing the love of a customer over the love of a founder or a co-founder.
Yeah.
What do you think about that speed?
I think that's exactly right. It's one of the main influences, which I think is a topic we're going to talk about in the next episode, like this, our kind of affinity for an authoritarian structure in both startups and large-scale businesses. Everybody always says democracy is the most inefficient form of government, but it's the best one we have. I think that's totally true. Thing I would push back on about specifically speed is if this kind of domineering attitude, this myopia, is going to eventually fracture your co-founding team, it might also eventually kill your company. It doesn't matter how fast you're going if you're going very quickly to death.
Could like we talk about the
Exactly.
need of pivoting. If
Mhm.
you are myopic, you cannot pivot as
Yes.
easily, if
Because
at
you can't
all.
see if you've got the blinders on, you can't see the other paths. You can't really get a lot of negative feedback or outside opinions, and that can be a thing that kills your company. So I think that's the tension as well, is how do you go fast enough that you feel like you can make progress and achieve your goals in a timely manner and quick to whatever systems are like wanting you to go faster. Um, but also, how do you make sure that speed is taking you to a place that is an outcome that's positive for you, your business, your customers, your co-founder, the entire network that also relies on the business existing and not just moving quickly. That's a hard tension to realize. I think the uh, the question being, how do you stay friends with your co-founders, implies that is something that you as a founder want to prioritize, which is not true of every founding team. If that is something you want to prioritize, then I think the only way you can do that is by making sure that you prioritize the relationships in your business over just thinking about the business outcome and not the interpersonal outcome. An example of why I think it's important to think of that interpersonal outcome as well, in the case of me and Keith, Keith and I work really well together. We still do. And if our relationship had fractured when our company had ended, we wouldn't have the opportunity to start potentially another company together. There's this other long term of maybe this company, this product, this market is not where you guys are meant to be. But if you prioritize the relationship, you get more shots at bat. If you deprioritize the relationship, you really only get maybe zero, like if
Yeah.
it ends poorly. Now, there's also a lot of examples. Our good boy, the Zuck, where he dismantles his entire founding team and I think currently owns close to 60% of Facebook or Meta. And that seems to have worked out nicely for whatever his goals are, at least from the outside. But again, it's just, do you want to prioritize having a positive relationship with the people you work with or not? If you do, you have to make an effort. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's not just you. I think I've experienced the same thing. The idea of move fast and break things has informed a lot of the culture around software and startups today. Inherent in that idea, there's this saying of, if you want to move fast, go alone. If you
Mhm.
want to go far, you go together.
Yeah,
You want to build
exactly.
that team that can go the distance with you. I've been thinking a lot about, how can you build a team around specifically a software business that perhaps is structured like a co-op.
Mhm.
But how do you attract the talent you need to get past the MVP?
Mm.
We're talking equity. We're talking cash.
Yeah.
Where do investors come in? How do we get people excited about whatever the businesses we're doing within the co-op structure?
Businesses are ones where every member of the business has an equal share of equity. That comes directly in the face of you usually work towards structuring a startup, right? There's usually a majority owner who's either had the idea or has the skills to build the thing or whatever it is. There's a bunch of like ways that people decide who should be the majority owner. And then you have other co-founders. You run spreadsheets that people on the internet have made to try to rank people's skills. In cooperative business, everyone has an equal share. The counterpoint to that is, because everyone is going to have an equal share as the business grows, the founding team doesn't have as much incentive because of that equity given out, right? If the team stays small, like less than 5 people, a big incentive. We're all going to share in the profits and outcomes of the business. That feels cool. Everyone would have a 20% stake. To some people, that would seem cool. To others, they'd feel like that was unfair and that they deserve more, whatever it is. The point is that one thing going down this road encourages is the fact that you don't have to have these conversations, right? If we're talking about speed, so much time gets lost when you're constantly feeling resentment or having to have discussions about equity compensation between co-founders. Equity is still the number one reason why co-founding teams split up, like resentment over ownership. In a cooperative business, you don't have to deal with that. But Henry, you're talking about, how do you actually encourage people to join a team, right? Salaries are only acquired through debt financing.
Yeah.
where there's not as much upside in terms of large scale pay because you're probably not going to be venture backed because venture capitalists don't usually invest in co-ops. That's your current struggle right now, right?
Yeah, that's the struggle. And I think it's, whenever we're talking about equity in a startup, it's imaginary value, right? Like we
Exactly.
don't know. The exit strategy is a big question mark. I have not personally worked at a startup where equity was exchanged, but I've had many friends that have. And they typically take a less desirable salary with a little bit of equity that will vest within 1 or 2 years, with the idea that the company will sell within 3 to 5 years. So that's a basic calculation in a lot of my friends' minds. I'm excited about this project, so I want to work on it. I'm getting paid decently. I'm hoping that this equity is extremely lucrative for me in the short term. That is in stark contrast with a co op that says there is no 5 year exit. This co
Yeah.
op is here to stay. This is for people passionate about solving this problem. The best case scenario is we survive and thrive 10, 20 years down the road, and you
Yeah.
are paid handsomely in the form of a salary. There isn't really equity. Am I misrepresenting a co op structure there?
No, I don't think you are at all. I wrote a post about this startup equity and whether you should take a lower salary. The short of it is don't ever do that. It's a total gamble, whether that will amount to any money. The idea in 4 years, if you take that over time, that's $6,500
Yeah.
extra a year. If you're taking any less in salary than that, don't do it.
Yeah.
Like advocate for yourself. And of this incentive for co-ops, it is exactly, do you believe in this? Do you want this thing to exist? If you do, we will work together to try to make that happen. We will community rounds of funding, go to a bank and start a business like normal people have done for them like hundreds of years.
Yeah.
That's the path forward. Where that gets really tricky is finding a co-founding team is already so difficult, even in the
Mhm.
realm of infinite money so that you can have a salary. Startups are sexy and working at one is really easy. Even if it fails, you could leverage that experience to finding those people in that environment is already hard. Finding people that are just generally passionate about the thing you're working on and will do it for little financial upside other than just a normal job that they will not have potentially for a year and a half.
Yeah.
Like, if
Mhm.
you can find those people, they're going to be with you for a long time. You don't have to have large conversations about whether things feel fair in terms of equity and compensation because everyone feel that sense of trust to our earlier conversation that this relationship is important and we're aligned on this thing. Sarah, my wife, is actually starting a grocery cooperative in our town, which is the most popular form of cooperative registered in the United States. She's been interviewing for now 7 months for people to join her 5-person initial board. It's important
Yeah.
to find the people that are going to be really committed and essentially volunteer to make this thing exist for the next year and a half as they go through community rounds of funding, working with the city, all of these things that take so much time and will not get paid for that time, at least have some sense of control and development of a thing and potentially some money coming in forms of salary or back pay in the future. But yeah, that's the hard part about starting a cooperative in the US. There's very little early financial upside for your first founding team. It's more about commitment and belief that this thing is important.
To find those founding team members, because with my startup that I'm working on, we haven't launched yet, but I'm already thinking about, all right, how do we sustain from the initial launch? If this all goes well, how am I going to bring in specifically developers
Yeah.
to grow and maintain this thing? If we're not going to take on $1 million seed round or a multi-million-dollar seed round, then we can't pay those salaries. If we're not going to give up equity, or we're not going to give equity that is expected to have a huge payout in the form of a huge exit,
Yep.
then we take away that. You said it's a gamble. It is a gamble. To get those passionate people willing to sacrifice to make this happen, that's a challenge. That's something I'd love to learn more about, but that gets down to how do you motivate people? How do you build a team that people love to be a part of? And it's not just about the money or this carrot at the end of the stick that is actually a mirage because you're gambling with fake equity with no real tangible exit strategy in a crazy market you can't define. Do you think it's possible? Or do you think that attracting amazing talent in any industry or
Mm.
field, marketing, software development, product, do you think you can attract those people? Or is the idea of gambling for that juicy equity and that unicorn startup the only way to take them away from a really stable corporate job?
Motivations can't will one into somebody else. If you're lucky, you're speaking specifically about technical co-founders, which is the one that everyone always has trouble finding. If you get lucky, you find somebody that has technical chops and cares about the problem you're solving and the customer segment you're trying to serve. That's like a unicorn 1 in a million. If you're normal, like a normal person trying to start a software cooperative, I think it works more like what Sarah's going through, which is she wants this thing to exist. She does not know how to run a grocery store. She gets together with other people who want the thing to exist and don't know how to run a grocery store, but know how to go through the process of engaging community members, trying to show traction that if we built this, people would come here. Whether that looks like raising financial capital from the community or going out and getting a loan from the bank using that initial financial capital. And then you can use that capital to pay people to actually make the thing happen. In terms of how that translates to running a software cooperative, I think that looks like using tools that exist today to come up with design concepts, even full scale, like running MVPs with no code tools, going to the community, going to your customers to say, I've got this thing that I'm trying to make. Would you use it? Would you pay, be part of this cooperative and support it? And then using that initial round of crowdfunding or whatever it is to get a loan, or even using that as enough startup capital to pay a developer either tweaks to the currently running system or to re-implement it. I think that's when we're talking about the difference between speed, sustainability, long-term incentives, short-term incentives. So I don't know where you put your energy in terms of trying to either find the super motivated technical person or trying to just do the slow work of building a passionate community that actually wants your product to exist and potentially learning new skills to make happen. Specifically because I've never done that before. But I feel like those are the paths that make the most sense to me in terms of how you would map a traditional cooperative onto a software business and map traditional startup values onto a cooperative business.
And it all comes back to relationships and friendships,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. Who you like working with, whether they like working with you. This is what Michael Scott meant. Business is about people.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that a little bit of luck takes hard work. I like of building a company that is going the distance with people that you
Mm-hmm.
want to work with. I think that's what all entrepreneurs deep down want. They want that autonomy, they want that creativity, potentially they want that ownership as well over something they've built. I'm excited to put that to the test, being friends with the founding team, maintaining those relationships, potentially structuring a company like a co-op. Both things are difficult to do. We're acknowledging
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah.
One of the ways that I'm trying to achieve those things is by having multiple revenue streams,
Yeah,
not
totally.
putting all my eggs in this undefined high risk gamble of
Yeah.
building a startup. I think that's really important and has helped me figure out exactly what I want to do, not rush, not overextend myself, not overpromise to a potential investor or a co-founder. It's allowed me to be honest, know what I want to do, and for the most part, be pretty happy while doing it. I'm excited to see what the next chapter is, and I'll keep you posted.
You're an inspiration to me, Henry. You're going down the path that in so many ways I wish I had done with Lumastic. And it's very cool to watch your journey. And I'm very excited potentially very soon to be able to, on this platform, people to go look at what you've been working on. I got an early preview. I'm super stoked for you. I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to see play out and to document.